The train screeched to a halt in the middle of nowhere, steam hissing into the frigid Montana air like the dying breath of some great beast. Through the frost-covered window, Eleanor Hayes pressed her face against the glass, searching for any sign of civilization in the endless white expanse. The conductor's voice boomed through the car. "Last stop before the blizzard hits, folks. Anyone getting off here better do it now. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Eleanor clutched her carpetbag tighter, her wedding dress folded. Carefully inside, along with the single photograph of a man she'd never met, Thomas Brennan, her future husband, a rancher who'd answered her advertisement in the Chicago Tribune with exactly 7 words. "Come to Copper Falls. We'll provide everything needed." What she found waiting for her in that howling wilderness would change everything she thought she knew about love, survival, and the strange ways 2 broken souls can heal each other without ever speaking a word. The wooden platform creaked under Eleanor's boots as she stepped down from the train car, immediately hit by a wall of cold so fierce it stole her breath. Snow whipped around her like tiny daggers, and she pulled her thin wool coat tighter, realizing with growing dread that it would be utterly useless against what was coming. "You, Eleanor Hayes." The voice came from behind her, rough and weathered, like old leather. She turned to see a man emerging from the storm, tall, broad-shouldered, with a thick beard dusted white with snow. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and distant, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away. "Yes, I'm Eleanor. You must be Thomas Brennan." He nodded once, then reached for her bag without ceremony. His hands were massive, scarred from years of hard work, and when his fingers briefly brushed hers, she noticed they were surprisingly gentle despite their roughness. "Storm's coming fast," he said, loading her bag into a weathered wagon hitched to 2 sturdy horses. "This'll need to get moving." Eleanor climbed onto the wooden seat beside him, pulling her skirts close as the wind picked up. Thomas wrapped a heavy buffalo hide around her shoulders without asking, then snapped the reins. The horses lurched forward into the growing tempest. They rode in silence through a landscape that seemed carved from ice and loneliness. Eleanor stole glances at her new husband, trying to read something, anything, in his weathered profile. Back in Chicago, she'd imagined this moment countless times. Conversations about their future, nervous laughter as they got to know each other, perhaps even a shy smile or 2. Instead, Thomas Brennan sat like a statue carved from granite, his attention fixed on the barely visible trail ahead. The only sounds were the creak of wagon wheels, the snort of horses, and the increasingly violent howl of wind through the pines. "How much further?" Eleanor asked after what felt like hours, her teeth chattering despite the buffalo hide. "Mile, maybe 2. His voice was nearly lost in the storm. The ranch, when it finally appeared through the swirling snow, was smaller than Eleanor had expected, but solid-looking. A log cabin with smoke rising from the chimney, a barn nearby, and several outbuildings scattered across the property. Everything looked weathered but well-maintained, built to withstand the harsh Montana winters. Thomas pulled the wagon up to the cabin's front porch and jumped down, immediately moving to help Eleanor. His hands circled her waist as he lifted her from the seat, and for a moment their faces were close enough that she could see the flecks of green in his grey eyes. Then he set her down and stepped back as if she'd burned him. "Come on," he said, grabbing her bag. Fires warm inside. The cabin's interior was sparse but comfortable. Rough-hewn furniture, a stone fireplace crackling with orange flames, shelves lined with books and practical supplies. Everything was scrupulously clean, organized with military precision. Eleanor noticed there was only one bedroom visible through an open doorway. "You can have the bedroom," Thomas said, following her gaze. "I'll take the loft." He pointed to a ladder leading to what looked like a small sleeping area above the main room. Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and disappointment she couldn't quite explain. "Thank you," she said. "That's very considerate." Thomas nodded and walked to the window, peering out at the storm that was now raging in full force. The wind screamed around the cabin like a living thing trying to get inside. "This one's going to last a while," he said. "Maybe 3, 4 days. We're stuck." Eleanor set her bag down and moved closer to the fire, trying to warm her hands. The reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was alone in the wilderness with a man she didn't know, trapped by a blizzard that could kill them if they tried to venture outside. In Chicago, this would have been scandalous. Here, it was simply survival. "Are you hungry?" she asked, looking around for some way to make herself useful. "I could cook something." Thomas glanced at her, and for the first time she thought she saw something like surprise cross his features. "You don't need to do that. I'd like to. It's what wives do, isn't it?" The word wives hung in the air between them like smoke. They weren't married yet, wouldn't be until they could get to town and find a preacher. But Eleanor had traveled 1,500 miles to become this man's wife, and she was determined to start somewhere. Thomas pointed to a cupboard near the small kitchen area. "Supplies are there, whatever you can find." Eleanor spent the next hour preparing a simple meal of salt pork, beans and biscuits, while Thomas tended to the horses and checked the other buildings. When he came back inside, his beard was white with frost and his cheeks were red from the cold. "Animals are secure," he said, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. "This storm's worse than I thought." They ate in relative silence, the only conversation being Eleanor's questions about the ranch and Thomas's brief, practical answers. He owned 200 acres, raised cattle and horses, had been working the land for 8 years. His previous wife had died of fever 3 winters ago. He needed help with the ranch work and figured marriage was the most practical solution. It wasn't romantic, but Eleanor appreciated his honesty. Her own reasons for leaving Chicago weren't particularly romantic either. A failed engagement to a banker who'd left her for a younger woman, debts she couldn't pay, and a family who saw her as a burden at 26. After dinner, Thomas climbed to the loft while Eleanor settled into the bedroom. The bed was larger than she'd expected, covered with thick quilts that smelled faintly of cedar and something she couldn't identify, something masculine and clean. She lay awake listening to the storm rage outside and the soft sounds of Thomas moving around above her. Occasionally, she heard the creak of floorboards or the rustle of blankets, and she found herself wondering what he was thinking about up there in his lonely loft. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find Thomas already gone from the cabin. She could hear him outside, the rhythmic sound of wood being chopped despite the continuing storm. She dressed quickly and found him in the barn, splitting logs with mechanical precision. "Good morning," she called over the wind. He looked up, nodded, and went back to his work. Eleanor watched him for a moment, mesmerized by the fluid way he swung the axe, the easy strength in his movements. Snow had gathered on his shoulders and in his dark hair, but he seemed immune to the cold. "Can I help with anything?" she asked. Thomas paused, considering. "Know anything about horses?" "A little. My father had a mare when I was young." He gestured toward the stalls where 2 horses stood munching hay. "They need brushing, keeps them calm during storms." Eleanor spent the morning working alongside Thomas in companionable silence. She brushed the horses while he repaired a broken bridle and checked the feed supplies. It was peaceful work, and she found herself relaxing for the first time since leaving Chicago. When they returned to the cabin for lunch, Eleanor noticed Thomas watching her more closely than before, as if trying to figure something out. She caught him looking several times, and each time he quickly turned away. "The storm should break tomorrow," he said, as they ate bread and cheese by the fire. "What happens then?" We go to town, find Reverend Morrison, get this done proper. Eleanor nodded, though something in his tone made the wedding sound more like a business transaction than a celebration, which, she supposed, was exactly what it was. That afternoon, as the blizzard continued to rage, Eleanor explored the cabin more thoroughly. The books on the shelves were an interesting mix. Practical volumes on ranching and animal husbandry, alongside collections of poetry and several well-worn novels. She found herself surprised that this taciturn man would own books by Whitman. And Thoreau, you read a lot, she observed when Thomas came in from another trip to check the animals. He glanced at the book in her hands, a volume of Emerson essays, and shrugged. Long winters, not much else to do. What's your favorite? Thomas looked genuinely surprised by the question, as if no one had ever asked his opinion about anything beyond ranch work. He was quiet for so long, Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Thoreau, he said finally, makes sense to me. Simple living, being self-sufficient. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Eleanor smiled. Walden was one of my favorites too, though I always wondered if he wasn't a bit lonely out there by himself. Thomas studied her face with those pale eyes. Sometimes lonely is better than the alternative. There was something in his voice, a weight, a sadness, that made Eleanor want to ask more questions. But before she could, Thomas had turned away and was adding wood to the fire. The second night passed much like the first, with Eleanor in the bedroom and Thomas in the loft. But this time, she found herself more aware of his presence above her, wondering about the man she was about to marry. He wasn't cruel or unkind, but there was a wall around him that seemed as solid as the mountains surrounding his ranch. On the third morning, Eleanor woke to silence. The wind had finally stopped. She dressed quickly and found Thomas already outside, surveying the damage from the storm. The snow was knee-deep, pristine and blinding in the morning sun. Beautiful, Eleanor said, stepping onto the porch. Thomas nodded, but his attention was focused on practical matters. Road'll be passable by afternoon. We can make town before dark. Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness. In a few hours, she would be Mrs. Thomas Brennan, legally bound to this silent man and his isolated ranch. It was what she'd come here for. But the reality felt more daunting than she'd expected. Thomas, she said, before we go to town, I want you to know I'll do my best to be a good wife to you. I know this isn't a love match, but I'll work hard and I won't complain about the isolation. He turned to look at her, and for a moment, his expression softened. You don't know what you're signing up for, Eleanor. This life, it's harder than you think. I'm stronger than I look. I can see that. He was quiet for a moment, then added, but strength isn't always enough out here. This country breaks things. People, dreams, promises, breaks them without even trying. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. Then we'll just have to be more stubborn than the country. Something flickered in Thomas's eyes. Surprise, maybe even the ghost of a smile. But it was gone so quickly Eleanor might have imagined it. We'd better get ready, he said. Long ride to town. As Eleanor went inside to pack her few belongings, she found herself thinking about the man she was about to marry. He was nothing like what she'd expected, neither cruel nor kind, neither welcoming nor hostile. He was like the landscape itself, beautiful, harsh, and utterly uncompromising. But there was something else there too, something she glimpsed in unguarded moments. A gentleness in the way he'd wrapped the buffalo hide around her shoulders, a quiet intelligence in his choice of books, a sadness that seemed to run as deep as the mountain streams. Eleanor Hayes had come to Montana looking for security and a fresh start. What she was beginning to realize was that she might have found something much more complicated and much more dangerous to her heart than she'd ever bargained for. The wagon ride to Copper Falls took them through landscapes that seemed carved from another world entirely. Eleanor had never seen a country so vast and untamed, rolling hills dotted with pine trees, distant mountains that scraped the sky, and valleys so deep they seemed to swallow sound itself. The silence between her and Thomas had become less awkward and more companionable, punctuated only by the steady clip-clop of hooves and the creak of wagon wheels on packed snow. Thomas guided the horses with practiced ease, his attention constantly scanning the horizon for signs of trouble. Eleanor found herself studying his profile again, noting the way his jaw tightened when they passed certain landmarks, the way his shoulders tensed whenever they crested a hill. There were stories written in the lines of his face, stories she was beginning to suspect weren't pleasant ones. That ridge there, Thomas said suddenly, pointing to a rocky outcropping about a mile to their left. Lost my first cattle drive near there. Stampede during a thunderstorm. 23 head gone in 5 minutes. It was the most he'd volunteered about himself since she'd arrived, and Eleanor seized the opportunity. How long ago was that? 6 years. First year I tried running cattle on my own. He paused, then added, learned real quick that this country doesn't forgive mistakes. Eleanor wanted to ask about his wife, about the loneliness she sensed in him, about why a man who could discuss Thoreau chose to live in such isolation. But something in his tone warned her off, so she simply nodded and watched the landscape roll by. Copper Falls, when it finally appeared in the distance, was smaller than even Eleanor's modest expectations. A single main street lined with wooden buildings, a church steeple rising above the rest, maybe 50 or 60 structures in total. Smoke curled from chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily business despite the recent storm. Not much to look at, Thomas said, following her gaze. It's perfect, Eleanor replied, and meant it. After the crushing anonymity of Chicago, a town where everyone knew everyone seemed like a gift, Thomas gave her a sharp look, as if trying to determine whether she was being sarcastic. Finding no trace of insincerity in her expression, he simply nodded and guided the wagon toward what appeared to be the town's main thoroughfare. The church was a simple white building with a bell tower that had seen better days. Reverend Morrison turned out to be a thin, energetic man in his 50s, with kind eyes and hands that moved constantly as he spoke. He welcomed them into his modest parlor with genuine warmth. Thomas Brennan, he said, shaking hands with obvious pleasure. Haven't seen you in town since Martha's funeral. How are you managing out there? Eleanor saw Thomas's jaw tighten at the mention of his previous wife, but his voice remained steady. Managing fine, Reverend. This is Eleanor Hayes. We're here to be married. Reverend Morrison turned his attention to Eleanor, his expression curious but welcoming. Miss Hayes, what a pleasure. Thomas wrote to me about your arrival. Welcome to our little community. Thank you, Reverend. I'm happy to be here. I do hope you'll consider joining our congregation. We have a lovely group of ladies who would be delighted to welcome a new member. Mrs. Patterson runs our ladies' auxiliary, and Mrs. Chen has been looking for someone to help with the church social activities. Eleanor glanced at Thomas, who was staring out the window with studied indifference. I'd like that very much. The ceremony itself was brief and practical, witnessed by the Reverend's wife and the town doctor who happened to be visiting. Eleanor wore her best dress, a simple blue wool that brought out her eyes, while Thomas had cleaned up as much as his rough lifestyle allowed. When Reverend Morrison asked if they had rings, Thomas produced a plain gold band that had clearly belonged to his first wife. Eleanor felt a pang at the sight of it, but she said nothing as Thomas slipped it onto her finger with hands that trembled slightly. The metal was warm, as if it had been resting close to his heart. "You may kiss the bride," Reverend Morrison announced. Thomas hesitated for a long moment, then leaned down and pressed his lips briefly to Eleanor's. It was barely more than a whisper of contact, but Eleanor felt heat flood her cheeks nonetheless. "Congratulations, Mr. and Mrs. Brennan," the Reverend said warmly. "May God bless your union." After the ceremony, Thomas suggested they stop at the general store to pick up supplies before heading home. Eleanor was grateful for the delay. She needed time to process the fact that she was now legally married to this enigmatic man. The store was a treasure trove of goods that Eleanor hadn't seen since leaving Chicago. Bolts of fabric, cooking implements, books and magazines, even a small selection of ladies' toiletries. She moved through the aisles with something approaching wonder, while Thomas conducted business with the proprietor, a jovial man named Henderson. "New wife, eh, Thomas?" Henderson said with a grin. "About time you found someone to keep you company out there. Gets mighty lonely in the winter." Thomas's response was non-committal, but Eleanor noticed he watched her carefully as she examined the merchandise. When she paused to look at a bolt of green fabric, he appeared at her elbow. "You like that?" "It's beautiful. I was thinking it might make nice curtains for the cabin." Without a word, Thomas called Henderson over and purchased 3 yards of the fabric, along with thread and a packet of needles. Eleanor started to protest that it wasn't necessary, but something in Thomas's expression stopped her. "A house needs fixing up," he said simply. "Do what you want with it." The ride home was different from the morning's journey. Eleanor found herself more aware of the man beside her, now her husband, and the ring on her finger that seemed to weigh more than it should. The landscape looked different too, less foreign, and more like something she might learn to call home. "Tell me about Martha," Eleanor said suddenly, then immediately regretted the words. But they were out now, hanging in the cold air between them. Thomas's hands tightened on the reins, and for a moment Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Met her in Denver. She was a schoolteacher, came west to work at the mission school. Smart woman, too smart for her own good, maybe. What happened to her? Fever. Started as a cold, turned into something worse. By the time I got her to the doctor in Billings, it was too late." He was quiet for a long moment. She hated the isolation, always talking about going back east, visiting her sister in Philadelphia. I kept promising we'd go, kept finding reasons to put it off, told myself there'd be time later. Eleanor heard the guilt in his voice, the regret that had probably been eating at him for 3 years. I'm sure she understood. Running a ranch is demanding work. She died thinking I cared more about the cattle than I did about her. Thomas's voice was flat, matter of fact. Maybe she was right. Eleanor wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that she could see the depth of his pain in every line of his face. Instead, she said, "I'm not Martha, Thomas. I chose this life knowing what it was." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "Maybe, but this country has a way of changing people, making them harder than they meant to be." When they reached the ranch, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of orange and pink. Eleanor was surprised to find that the sight of the modest cabin filled her with something like contentment. It wasn't much, but it was hers now, theirs. Thomas helped her down from the wagon with the same careful gentleness he'd shown before. But this time, when his hands circled her waist, Eleanor was acutely aware that he was her husband now. The thought sent a flutter of nervousness through her stomach. "I'll tend to the horses," Thomas said. "Get yourself settled." Eleanor spent the next hour making small changes to the cabin's interior, hanging her few dresses in the bedroom wardrobe, arranging her books on a shelf, and setting out the fabric she planned to make into curtains. It was amazing how these tiny touches made the space feel more like home. When Thomas came in from the barn, he stopped short at the sight of her belongings mingled with his. Eleanor's hairbrush sat next to his shaving implements on the washstand. Her shawl hung on a peg beside his coat. Her books were shelved next to his volumes of poetry. "Looks different," he said. "Is that all right?" Thomas nodded slowly. "It's fine. Good, even. Place needed a woman's touch." They ate dinner by the fire, venison stew that Thomas had prepared earlier in the week, along with fresh bread Eleanor had made that afternoon. The meal was better than anything she'd managed in her tiny Chicago boarding house room, and she found herself relaxing as they ate. "You're a good cook," Thomas observed. "Thank you. My mother taught me before she died. She said a woman should know how to feed her family properly." "When did you lose her?" "I was 16. Consumption. My father remarried within a year to a woman who made it clear I wasn't welcome." Eleanor hadn't meant to share so much, but something about the firelight and the quiet intimacy of the cabin made confidences easier. Thomas nodded as if he understood. "Why did you answer my advertisement?" "Partly. That and the fact that my engagement fell through rather spectacularly. Chicago society has a long memory for scandal." "What kind of scandal?" Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks. "The kind where you discover your fiancé has been keeping a mistress for 6 months, and everyone knows about it, except you." Thomas studied her face in the firelight. His loss. The simple statement, delivered without flattery or false comfort, meant more to Eleanor than any of the elaborate compliments her ex-fiancé had ever paid her. After dinner, they sat by the fire reading, Thomas with a book of Whitman's poetry, Eleanor with one of the novels from his shelf. The domestic scene felt surreal to Eleanor, who had expected her wedding night to be either romantic or terrifying. Instead, it was peaceful in a way she hadn't anticipated. "Thomas," she said eventually, "about the sleeping arrangements. Nothing's changed," he said quickly, not looking up from his book. "You take the bedroom, I'll stay in the loft." Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. "Are you sure? I don't want to put you out of your own bed." "I'm sure. You need your privacy. We barely know each other." He was right, of course. They were strangers bound by a legal document and practical necessity. But Eleanor found herself wondering what it would be like to share more than just a name with this complicated man. Later, as she lay in the big bed listening to Thomas move around in the loft above, Eleanor reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she'd been planning a wedding to a man she'd thought she loved. Now she was married to a man she barely knew, in a place so remote it might as well have been another planet. But for the first time in years, Eleanor felt something she hadn't expected: hope. Thomas Brennan was not an easy man, but he was an honest one. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep or offer false comfort. What he offered was real protection, partnership, and maybe eventually something deeper. The next morning, Eleanor woke to find Thomas already gone and a pot of coffee warming on the stove. Outside, she could hear him working with the horses, his voice low and soothing as he spoke to the animals. She dressed quickly and went out to find him. "Morning," she called. Thomas looked up from brushing one of the mares, nodded his greeting. "Storm's coming in later today. Need to get the animals secure." Eleanor looked at the sky, which seemed clear enough to her, but she'd learned to trust Thomas's weather sense. "What can I do to help?" "You don't need to, Thomas." Eleanor's voice was firmer than usual. "We're partners now. I want to help." He studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the barn. "Chickens need feeding. Coops behind the barn, feeds in the grain bin." Eleanor spent the morning learning the rhythms of ranch life. The chickens were friendlier than she'd expected, clucking softly as she scattered grain in their enclosure. The milk cow, A placid brown creature named Bessie required some coaxing, but eventually allowed Eleanor to try her hand at milking. By noon, the sky had clouded over and the wind was picking up. Thomas appeared at the barn door, satisfaction evident in his expression as he watched Eleanor competently handle the farm chores. "You're a quick learner," he said. "I told you I was stronger than I looked." "Yes, you did." There was something in his voice that made Eleanor look up sharply, but Thomas had already turned away. That afternoon, as the first snowflakes began to fall, Eleanor worked on cutting and hemming the green fabric into curtains, while Thomas repaired harnesses and tended to indoor chores. The domestic scene felt natural, as if they'd been married for years instead of days. But Eleanor was beginning to understand that life with Thomas Brennan would be full of contradictions. He was a man who could quote Thoreau, but chose to live in isolation, who could be gentle with animals, but kept his emotional walls firmly in place, who had married her for practical reasons, but treated her with a consideration that went beyond mere politeness. As the snow continued to fall outside their warm cabin, Eleanor found herself wondering what it would take to reach the heart of this mysterious man she'd married, and whether, when she finally did, she'd find something worth the effort. The second blizzard arrived with a vengeance just after midnight, shaking the cabin with winds so fierce that Eleanor jolted awake, thinking the roof might tear away. She lay in bed, listening to the howling outside, grateful for the solid log walls that Thomas had built to withstand exactly this kind of assault from nature. Above her, she heard movement in the loft, the creak of floorboards, then the soft thud of boots hitting the main room floor. Moments later, she smelled smoke and saw the orange glow of firelight beneath her bedroom door. Thomas was feeding the fire, probably checking the windows and doors for drafts that could let in the killing cold. Eleanor wrapped a shawl around her nightgown and crept to the door, opening it a crack. Thomas stood silhouetted against the fire, fully dressed despite the late hour. His shoulders were tense, and he kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting something terrible to break through. "Thomas," she whispered, "is everything all right?" He turned sharply, and in the firelight she could see something almost like fear in his expression. "Didn't mean to wake you. Go back to sleep." But Eleanor stepped into the main room, noticing how Thomas's hands shook slightly as he adjusted the logs in the fireplace. "You're worried about something. What is it?" For a long moment, Thomas said nothing. Then, "This storm's worse than the one that killed Martha." The words hung between them like a physical presence. Eleanor moved closer, seeing the way Thomas's jaw worked as he stared into the flames. "She got sick during a storm like this," he continued, his voice barely audible above the wind. "Couldn't get her to town for help. Had to watch her burn with fever while the snow piled up outside, knowing that if I tried to take her for help, we'd both die in the drifts." Eleanor's heart clenched at the raw pain in his voice. Without thinking, she reached out and touched his arm. Thomas flinched but didn't pull away. "That's not going to happen again," she said firmly. "I'm healthy and strong, and this cabin is solid. We have plenty of food and fuel." "You don't understand." Thomas finally looked at her, and Eleanor was shocked by the anguish in his eyes. "I failed her, failed to protect her when she needed me most. What if I fail you too?" Eleanor felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of the burden Thomas had been carrying alone for 3 years. "Listen to me," she said, stepping closer. "You didn't fail Martha. Sometimes people get sick, and there's nothing anyone can do about it. You can't control the weather or disease or any of the other things that hurt people." Thomas stared at her, as if she were speaking a foreign language. "I brought her here, to this isolation. If she'd stayed in Denver, she might have died of fever there too, or been thrown from a horse, or caught in a fire, or any of 1,000 other things." Eleanor's voice was gentle but firm. You can't live your life trying to control everything that might go wrong. The wind chose that moment to slam against the cabin with renewed fury, rattling the windows and making both of them glance toward the door. Thomas's face went pale. "The barn," he said suddenly. "If the wind shifts, it could take part of the roof." "The animals!" He was already reaching for his coat when Eleanor caught his arm. "Thomas, no! You'll die out there. I have to check on them. The animals are fine. You built that barn to last, just like this cabin. You can't save everyone from everything." Thomas looked down at her hand on his arm, then at her face. Something in her expression seemed to reach him because his shoulders gradually relaxed. "I can't lose anyone else," he said quietly. "You won't lose me. I promise." They stood there for a moment, the firelight flickering between them, both aware. They'd crossed some invisible line. Eleanor was still touching Thomas's arm, and she could feel the warmth of his skin through the fabric of his shirt. Thomas was looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, gratitude mixed with something deeper, more complicated. "You should get some sleep," he said finally. But he made no move to pull away from her touch. "So should you. Come morning, we'll check on everything together." Thomas nodded slowly, then did something that surprised them both. He covered her hand with his own, squeezing gently before releasing it. "Thank you," he said. Eleanor returned to her room with her heart beating faster than the storm warranted. As she settled back into bed, she could hear Thomas moving around above her, but the sounds were calmer now, less frantic. Eventually, the cabin fell quiet except for the storm outside and the steady tick of the mantel clock. Morning revealed a world transformed yet again. The snow had drifted against the cabin windows, and everything beyond was a uniform white that hurt to look at. But the sun was shining, and when Thomas opened the door, the air that rushed in was sharp and clean rather than murderous. "Barn's fine," he announced after trudging through knee-deep snow to check on the animals. "Roof held. Animals are warm. You were right." Eleanor smiled as she handed him a cup of coffee. "I'm glad. How are the supplies holding up?" "We've got enough for another week, maybe two if we're careful. But this storm's going to make travel impossible for a while. We're well and truly snowed in." Eleanor expected to feel claustrophobic at the thought of being trapped in the small cabin for days on end. Instead, she felt oddly content. "Good thing we like each other's company." Thomas gave her a sharp look, as if trying to determine whether she was serious. Finding no trace of sarcasm in her expression, he almost smiled. "Good thing." The enforced confinement created an intimacy that neither of them had expected. With nowhere to go and nothing urgent to do except tend the fire and prepare meals, they began to talk, really talk, for the first time since Eleanor's arrival. She learned that Thomas had grown up on a farm in Ohio, that he'd come west after his parents died in a cholera outbreak, that he'd worked as a cowhand for 5 years before saving enough to buy his own land. He learned that Eleanor had taught school before her engagement, that she could play piano and spoke passable French, that she'd always dreamed of seeing the mountains. "Play something," Thomas said on the third day, nodding toward an old piano, in the corner that Eleanor had noticed but never heard used. "I haven't played in months. It's probably terribly out of tune. Don't care." Eleanor sat at the worn bench and ran her fingers over the keys. The piano was indeed out of tune, but it had a sweet, mellow tone that filled the cabin with music. She played simple pieces at first, folk songs and hymns, then gradually moved to more complex compositions as her confidence returned. Thomas listened from his chair by the fire, his expression unreadable but his attention complete. When Eleanor finished a particularly melancholy piece by Chopin, she turned to find him staring at her with something like wonder. "Martha never played," he said quietly. "Always meant to have it tuned, but never got around to it. Figured it was just taking up space." Music makes a house feel more like a home, Eleanor said. My mother used to say that. She was right. That evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Thomas surprised Eleanor by asking about her life in Chicago. She found herself telling him about the boarding house where she'd lived, the wealthy families whose children she'd tutored, the loneliness of being a single woman in a city full of strangers. "Weren't you scared?" Thomas asked. "Coming out here? To marry a man you'd never met?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. "Terrified," she admitted. "But I was more scared of staying where I was, becoming one of those bitter spinsters who never took any risks. And now I think I made the right choice." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Even though I'm not much of a husband," the question caught Eleanor off guard. "What do you mean?" "I don't talk much, don't know how to make pretty speeches or buy fancy things. Can't even promise to keep you safe from everything that might hurt you." Eleanor set down her mending and turned to face him fully. "Thomas, do you know what my life was like in Chicago? I lived in a room barely bigger than your barn stall. I ate the same 3 meals every week because I couldn't afford anything else. I spent my days teaching spoiled children whose parents treated me like a servant, and my evenings alone with nothing but my regrets for company." She gestured around. "The cabin, at the warm fire and comfortable furniture, at the books and piano and evidence of a life being built. This, what we have here, it's the first real home I've had since my mother died. You've given me safety, companionship, purpose. You treat me like an equal partner instead of a burden or an ornament. If that's not being a good husband, I don't know what is." Thomas looked stunned by her words. "I never thought of it that way. Maybe you should start." The conversation seemed to unlock something in Thomas. Over the following days, he began sharing stories about the early days of building the ranch, about the mistakes he'd made, and the lessons learned through hard experience. He told her about the first winter, when he'd nearly starved because he'd underestimated how much food he'd need, about the spring when flash floods had wiped out his first vegetable garden, about the gradual process of learning to read the weather and the land. Eleanor, in turn, shared her own stories, the music lessons she'd given to earn extra money, the books she'd read by candlelight in her tiny room, the dreams she'd harbored of someday having a family and a real home. "I used to imagine what my children would look like," she admitted one evening as they sat by the fire. "Silly, maybe, but I'd picture teaching them to read or showing them how to bake bread." Thomas glanced at her, then away. "You still could. Have children, I mean." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away. "Is that something you'd want?" she asked quietly. Thomas was quiet for so long, Eleanor thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, "I used to think so, before Martha died. Now I'm not sure I trust myself to protect anyone that is vulnerable. Children aren't made of glass, Thomas. They're tougher than you think." "Maybe." He looked at her then, really looked at her. "Maybe a lot of things are tougher than I think." On the 6th day of their confinement, Eleanor woke to find Thomas already up and moving around downstairs. But instead of the usual sounds of him tending the fire or preparing coffee, she heard something different, the rhythmic thunk of an axe biting wood. She dressed quickly and found Thomas in the main room, working on what appeared to be a construction project. Wood shavings littered the floor around a partially assembled frame that looked like it might become a piece of furniture. "What are you making?" Eleanor asked. Thomas paused in his work, looking almost embarrassed. "Bookshelf, for your books. Figured they deserved better than being crammed in with mine." Eleanor felt something warm unfurl in her chest. "That's very thoughtful." "It's not much. I'm better." With barns than fine carpentry, Eleanor examined the half-finished shelf. The craftsmanship was simple but solid, each joint fitted with care. "It's perfect," Thomas resumed his work, and Eleanor settled nearby with her mending, content to listen to the steady rhythm of his tools. There was something deeply satisfying about watching him create something with his hands, seeing the way he approached each task with patience and precision. "Thomas," she said after a while, "thank you." "For what?" "For making me feel at home here, for treating me like I belong." Thomas stopped working and looked at her. "You do belong here, Eleanor. I hope you know that." The simple statement, delivered without fanfare or decoration, meant more to Eleanor than any flowery declaration could have, because she was beginning to understand that with Thomas Brennan, words were never casual. When he said something, he meant it completely. As the storm finally began to exhaust itself outside, Eleanor reflected on the strange intimacy they'd built during their days of confinement. They had learned to move around each other in the small space without awkwardness, to anticipate each other's needs, to find comfort in each other's presence. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something solid and real and full of possibility. Like the bookshelf Thomas was building, their relationship was being constructed piece by careful piece, each joint fitted with attention and care. And for the first time since arriving in Montana, Eleanor began to believe that what they were building together might actually last. Spring arrived in Montana like a whispered promise, creeping across the landscape so gradually that Eleanor almost missed its first signs. The snow began to recede from the cabin's windows, revealing patches of brown earth that steamed in the weak sunlight. Icicles hanging from the eaves started their slow musical drip, creating a symphony that seemed to announce winter's retreat. Thomas had grown restless over the past week, checking the weather obsessively and spending long hours staring out at the mountains. Eleanor understood his impatience. After months of being confined by snow and cold, the approaching change of season promised freedom, work, and the return of life to the ranch. "Calving season coming," he announced one morning over breakfast. "Maybe 2 weeks, if the weather holds. Going to be busy times ahead." Eleanor looked up from her eggs. "What can I do to help?" Thomas paused, his coffee cup halfway to his lips. Even after months of marriage, he still seemed surprised when she offered to participate in ranch work instead of simply observing from the sidelines. "It's rough work," he said carefully. "Sometimes dangerous. Cows can be unpredictable when they're birthing, especially first-time mothers. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I've helped with birthing before. My cousin had a dairy farm outside Chicago. I know it's not the same as cattle, but the principles are similar." Thomas studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right. But you follow my lead out there. No arguments, no suggestions. Lives depend on split-second decisions." "Understood." The first calf arrived 3 days later during a late snow squall that had Thomas muttering curses under his breath as he struggled into his coat. Eleanor followed him to the barn through ankle-deep slush, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The cow, a young Hereford named Rosie, was in obvious distress, lowing pitifully as contractions racked her body. Thomas examined her quickly, his hands gentle but efficient. "Calf's positioned wrong," he said grimly. "Breech birth. Have to turn it, or we'll lose them both." Eleanor watched in fascination as Thomas worked, his movements careful and deliberate despite the urgency of the situation. His voice remained calm and soothing as he spoke to the frightened animal, even as sweat beaded on his forehead from the effort of manipulating the unborn calf. "There," he said finally, relief evident in his voice. "Got it. Eleanor, I need you to support the calf as it comes out. Don't let it drop. The cord might still be attached." The next few minutes passed in a blur of blood, fluid, and intense concentration. Eleanor found herself cradling a slippery, warm bundle of life as Thomas quickly cleared the newborn's airways and checked for injuries. The calf, a little bull, let out a weak but determined bellow that seemed to echo through the barn. "He's perfect," Thomas said, and Eleanor was amazed to hear genuine wonder in his voice, as if this weren't something he'd witnessed dozens of. Times before. Does it ever get old?" she asked, watching as the mother began to clean her baby. "Seeing new life come into the world." Thomas shook his head. "Never. Each one's a miracle, especially out here where so many things can go wrong." Over the following weeks, Eleanor threw herself into calving season with an enthusiasm that clearly surprised Thomas. She learned to recognize the signs of impending birth, to assist with difficult deliveries, and to care for newborns who needed extra attention. Her hands, once soft from city living, grew calloused from handling rope and helping to pull stubborn calves into the world. "You're a natural at this," Thomas told her one evening as they sat exhausted by the fire after a particularly difficult day. 3 calves had been born, including twins that had required Eleanor's quick thinking when one appeared to be stillborn. "I love it," Eleanor admitted. "I never imagined I could feel so useful, so necessary." Thomas looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, surprise mixed with something deeper, something that made her pulse quicken. "You are necessary," he said quietly. "More than you know." The words hung between them, heavy, with meaning neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't look away from Thomas's steady gaze. "I should check on the twins one more time before bed," she said finally, standing abruptly. Thomas nodded, but she felt his eyes following her as she pulled on her coat and headed for the barn. Outside, the night air was crisp with the promise of true spring. Stars blazed overhead in the clear mountain sky, and Eleanor could hear the distant sound of water running somewhere in the darkness. Snow melting, streams beginning to flow again after the long freeze. In the barn, the twin calves were sleeping peacefully next to their mother, who regarded Eleanor with calm, trusting eyes. Eleanor checked their breathing, their warmth, the way they were positioned. Everything looked perfect. She was about to leave when she heard footsteps behind her. Thomas appeared in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the starlight. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Perfect. They're both strong and healthy." Thomas stepped into the barn, moving to check the calves himself. His shoulder brushed against Eleanor's as he bent over the sleeping animals, and she was suddenly acutely aware of his closeness, the warmth radiating from his body, the way his hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "Eleanor," he said softly, turning to face her. "Yes?" For a moment they stood frozen in the dim barn, the air thick with unspoken tension. Eleanor could feel her heart beating so hard she was sure Thomas must hear it. His hand rose slowly, as if of its own accord, and touched her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. Thomas started, then stopped, his jaw working as if he were struggling with words that wouldn't come. Eleanor stepped closer, close enough to see the uncertainty in his eyes, the way his pupils had dilated in the low light. "What is it?" "I don't know how to do this," he said finally. "Don't know how to be what you need." Eleanor's heart broke a little at the vulnerability in his voice. "Thomas, you already are what I need. You just don't see it. I'm not good with words, can't make pretty speeches or—" Eleanor silenced him by rising on her toes and pressing her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative at first, but when Thomas's arms came up to encircle her waist, it deepened into something that made Eleanor's knees weak. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Thomas rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Eleanor," he whispered. "I know," she said, understanding everything he couldn't say. "I know." They walked back to the cabin in silence, but everything had changed. The careful distance they'd maintained for months had finally crumbled, replaced by something electric and alive and full of possibility. That night, for the first time since their marriage, Thomas didn't climb to the loft. Instead, he stood uncertainty in the main room while Eleanor prepared for bed. both of them acutely aware of the single-bedroom door and what lay beyond it. "I don't want to rush you," Thomas said. "Finally, don't want you to feel pressured or—" Eleanor appeared in the bedroom doorway, wearing only her nightgown and a soft smile. "Thomas, we've been married for 3 months. I don't think we're rushing anything." He moved toward her slowly, as if she might disappear if he moved too quickly. When he reached her, his hands rose to cup her face with infinite tenderness. "Are you sure?" Instead of answering with words, Eleanor took his hand and led him into the bedroom, closing the door softly behind them. The next morning brought a crisis that tested everything they'd built together. Eleanor woke to find Thomas already gone and the sound of shouting coming from the direction of the barn. She dressed quickly and ran outside to find Thomas standing over a cow that was clearly in severe distress. "What's wrong?" Eleanor asked. "Breathless from running. Milk fever," Thomas said grimly. "Sometimes it happens after calving. If we can't bring her temperature down, she'll die." Eleanor had read about milk fever in one of Thomas's veterinary books. It was a metabolic disorder that could kill a cow within hours if left untreated. "What do we need to do?" "Cold water, as much as we can get. Ice, if there's any left in the creek. And calcium. There's some in the medicine chest in the tack room." For the next 4 hours, they worked together with desperate efficiency. Eleanor hauled bucket after bucket of icy water, while Thomas administered medication and monitored the cow's vital signs. The animal, a valuable breeding cow named Duchess, grew progressively weaker despite their efforts. "It's not working," Thomas said finally, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and despair. "She's not responding." Eleanor looked at the suffering animal, then at Thomas's face. She could see the defeat creeping into his expression, the same look she'd seen during the blizzard when he'd been convinced he would fail again. "There's something else we can try," she said suddenly, remembering a passage from one of the veterinary books. "Dextrose solution administered intravenously. It's risky, but if the calcium isn't working—" Thomas stared at her. "That's a procedure for trained veterinarians. If I miss the vein or give too much, you won't miss. You have the steadiest hands of anyone I know." For a long moment, Thomas stood paralyzed by indecision. Eleanor could see the war going on inside him, the fear of failure battling against, the desperate need to save the animal. "I'll help you," Eleanor said firmly. "Walk me through it step by step. We can do this together." Thomas looked at her, then at the dying cow, then back at Eleanor. Something in her steady gaze seemed to give him strength. "All right," he said. "Get the medical kit from the house. And Eleanor, if this goes wrong, it won't go wrong. Trust yourself, Thomas. Trust us." The procedure was the most nerve-wracking 30 minutes of Eleanor's life. She held the cow's head steady while Thomas carefully inserted the needle into the jugular vein, both of them holding their breath as he began the slow injection of dextrose solution. For a long minute, nothing happened. The cow's breathing remained shallow, her eyes dull and unfocused. Eleanor began to fear they'd been too late, that all their efforts had been in vain. Then gradually, almost imperceptibly, Duchess began to improve. Her breathing deepened, her eyes cleared. She lifted her head and looked around with something approaching alertness. "It's working," Eleanor whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Thomas sat back on his heels, his hands shaking with exhaustion and relief. "She's going to make it." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, tears of relief, of joy, of pride in what they'd accomplished together. Without thinking, she threw her arms around Thomas's neck, holding him close as the magnitude of their success sank in. "We did it," she said against his shoulder. "We saved her." Thomas held her tightly, his own emotion evident in the way his voice shook. "We did. God, Eleanor, if you hadn't remembered about the dextrose, and if you hadn't had the skill to administer it properly, we make a good team, Thomas Brennan." He pulled back to look at her, and Eleanor saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was love, deep, genuine, overwhelming love that he was finally allowing himself to feel. "Yes," he said simply, "we do." As spring progressed and the ranch came fully alive with new calves and fresh grass, Eleanor reflected on how completely her life had changed. She'd come to Montana looking for security and a fresh start. What she'd found was something infinitely more precious, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared challenges, and growing love. The silent rancher who'd met her at the train station had become a man who spoke to her with his eyes, his hands, his careful attention to her needs and dreams. And Eleanor had discovered strengths in herself she'd never known existed. The ability to face danger with courage, to work alongside the man she was learning to love, to build something real and lasting in this harsh, beautiful wilderness. Their love story wasn't written in flowery words or grand gestures. It was written in shared labor, in quiet moments by the fire, in the trust they'd built through crisis and calm. It was a love as solid and enduring as the mountains that surrounded their home, and Eleanor couldn't imagine wanting anything more. Summer in Montana arrived with a fury of color and growth that left Eleanor breathless. The meadows exploded into wildflower carpets of purple lupine, yellow arnica, and scarlet paintbrush. The streams, swollen with snowmelt, rushed down from the mountains with a voice that could be heard for miles. And everywhere, life seemed to pulse with an intensity that made Eleanor understand why Thomas had chosen this harsh, beautiful place to build his dreams. The ranch thrived under their joint management. The calves from spring had grown into sturdy youngsters. The vegetable garden Eleanor had planted was producing more food than they could eat, and Thomas had begun talking about expanding the herd next year. But it was the changes in Thomas himself that amazed Eleanor most. The silent, guarded man who had met her at the train station had gradually given way to someone who sang while he worked, who brought her wildflowers for no reason, who would stop what he was doing just to kiss her when she passed by. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow blossoming, like the prairie flowers that emerged after the brutal winter. "You're humming," Eleanor observed one morning as Thomas repaired a section of fence near the house. He paused, hammer in mid-swing, looking embarrassed. "Was I?" "You were." It was lovely. Thomas ducked his head, but Eleanor caught the smile he tried to hide. These moments of self-consciousness reminded her that underneath his growing confidence, he was still the man who had been convinced he was too damaged to love or be loved. The first test of their newfound happiness came from an unexpected source. Eleanor was hanging laundry when she spotted a rider approaching from the east, unusual because most visitors came from the direction of town. As the figure drew closer, she realized it was a woman, riding side saddle on a beautiful chestnut mare. Thomas emerged from the barn at the sound of hoofbeats, and Eleanor saw his entire body go rigid. The color drained from his face as the woman dismounted near the porch. She was stunning, elegant in a way that made Eleanor acutely aware of her own work-worn dress and sun-weathered hands. Dark hair, perfectly arranged beneath a fashionable hat, skin like porcelain, and clothes that spoke of money and sophistication. Everything about her screamed city refinement. "Hello, Thomas," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. "Aren't you going to invite me in?" Thomas seemed frozen, so Eleanor stepped forward. "I'm Eleanor Brennan, Thomas's wife." The woman's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose slightly. "Wife? How unexpected. I'm Victoria Ashford. Thomas and I are old friends." Eleanor felt Thomas move to stand beside her, his hand finding the small of her back in a gesture that was both protective and possessive. "Victoria, what are you doing here?" "Business, darling. Daddy's expanding his railroad interests, and Montana seems to be the next frontier. When I heard you'd settled here, I simply had to come see for myself." Victoria's gaze swept over the modest ranch with barely concealed disdain. Though I must say, it's even more rustic than I imagined. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks at the implied insult, but Thomas's voice remained steady. It suits us fine. Where are you staying? The hotel in Copper Falls, though calling it a hotel is rather generous. The accommodations are... Victoria shuddered delicately. Well, let's just say I won't be staying long. Eleanor found herself studying the interplay between Thomas and this unexpected visitor. There was history here. She could see it in the way Victoria looked at Thomas, in the careful neutrality of his responses, in the tension that seemed to crackle between them. "Would you like some coffee?" Eleanor offered, remembering her manners despite her growing unease. "How kind," Victoria said, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'd love to catch up with Thomas. It's been so long since we've had a proper conversation." They settled on the porch, Eleanor serving coffee in her best china, while Victoria regaled them with stories of her travels, her father's business ventures, and the social whirl of Denver society. Every word seemed calculated to emphasize the gulf between her sophisticated world and the simple life Eleanor and Thomas had built. "Do you remember the midsummer ball at the Brown Palace Hotel?" Victoria asked Thomas, her hand fluttering to rest briefly on his arm. "You looked so handsome in evening clothes. I still have the photograph we took that night." Eleanor saw Thomas's jaw tighten. "That was a long time ago, Victoria." "Not so long, surely. 3 years, 4. Time flies when you're having adventures." Victoria's laugh was like silver bells, beautiful and cold. "Though I suppose time moves differently out here, where there's so little to mark its passage." Eleanor excused herself to refill the coffee pot, but she could hear every word of their conversation from the kitchen. Victoria's voice carried easily through the open windows as she reminisced about parties, theatre performances, and mutual acquaintances from what was clearly Thomas's life before Montana. "Whatever happened to your plans for medical school?" Victoria asked. "You were so passionate about becoming a doctor. I always thought you'd change the world." Eleanor's hand stilled on the coffee pot. Medical school? Thomas had never mentioned anything about wanting to be a doctor. "Plans change," Thomas said curtly. "But darling, you had so much potential. Surely you don't intend to spend the rest of your life playing farmer in this wilderness." Eleanor returned to the porch to find Victoria leaning toward Thomas with an expression of concern that didn't quite mask something calculating in her eyes. Thomas looked like a man trapped between past and present, his face carefully blank, but his hands clenched into fists. "Thomas is an excellent rancher," Eleanor said firmly, setting the coffee pot down with perhaps more force than necessary. "He's built something real and lasting here." Victoria turned to her with a smile that was razor-sharp. How sweet. Though I imagine it must be quite an adjustment for someone from Thomas's background to embrace such a simple lifestyle. The condescension in her tone was unmistakable, and Eleanor felt her temper flare. But before she could respond, Thomas stood abruptly. "I think it's time you headed back to town, Victoria. It's a long ride, and storms come up quickly in the mountains." Victoria rose gracefully, clearly not surprised by the dismissal. "Of course, but I do hope we'll have another chance to visit before I leave. There's so much more I'd love to share with you, about the old days, about opportunities that might interest you." She paused at the steps, turning back with that calculated smile. "It was lovely meeting you, Eleanor. You're quite different from what I expected." Eleanor wasn't sure if that was meant as a compliment or an insult, but she managed a polite response. They watched in silence as Victoria mounted her horse and rode away, her perfect posture making the side saddle look effortless. "Who was she?" Eleanor asked when the rider had disappeared from view. Thomas was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with old pain. "Someone I knew in Denver." before I came here. Someone you cared about? Another long pause. I thought I did. Turned out I was wrong about a lot of things back then. Eleanor wanted to ask more, about medical school, about his life before Montana, about what had driven him to this isolated ranch. But something in Thomas's expression warned her that the subject was closed, at least for now. That evening, Thomas was unusually quiet during dinner. He pushed food around his plate without eating much, and his responses to Eleanor's attempts at conversation were monosyllabic. After they'd cleaned up, he retreated to the barn to check on the animals, though Eleanor knew he'd already done so twice that day. She found him there an hour later, sitting on a hay bale and staring at nothing. The horses nickered softly in their stalls, but Thomas seemed lost in thoughts that were clearly painful. "Talk to me," Eleanor said, settling beside him on the hay. Thomas looked at her as if surprised to find her there. "Nothing to talk about. That's not true, and we both know it. Victoria upset you. I want to understand why." Thomas was quiet for so long that Eleanor began to think he wouldn't answer. Then slowly, as if the words were being dragged from him, he began to speak. "I met Victoria in Denver 5 years ago. I was working for her father, learning the railroad business. Thought I was in love with her. Thought she felt the same way about me." Eleanor waited, sensing there was more. "I had plans. Back then. Was going to save enough money to go to medical school, become a doctor, maybe work for the railroad as a company physician. Victoria seemed to encourage it all. Said she admired my ambition." What happened? Thomas's laugh was bitter. "I found out what she really thought of me. Overheard her talking to her friends at a party. She was laughing about the country boy who actually believed she'd marry beneath her station. Said I was amusing enough for now, but of course she'd eventually marry someone suitable." Eleanor felt a stab of anger at the casual cruelty of it. "Thomas, I'm sorry. That night I realized I'd been living in a dream. Victoria, medical school, the life I thought I wanted. None of it was real, so I left. Came out here, bought this land, decided to build something that couldn't be taken away by other people's opinions." Eleanor began to understand the depth of the betrayal Thomas had experienced. It wasn't just romantic disappointment. It was the destruction of his entire vision of his future, his sense of his own worth. "Is that why you answered my advertisement?" she asked quietly. "Because it was safe. Because a mail-order bride couldn't hurt you the way Victoria did." Thomas turned to look at her, and Eleanor saw pain and shame warring in his expression. "Maybe. At first, I thought a practical arrangement would be easier." "And now?" Thomas reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "Now I know the difference between what I thought was love and what love actually is." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "What does love actually feel like?" "Like this," Thomas said simply. "Like wanting to be the best version of myself because you deserve it. Like finding peace in someone else's presence. Like believing I could face anything as long as you were beside me." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, overwhelmed by the simple honesty of his words. "That's exactly what love feels like to me, too." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the horses moving in their stalls and the distant sound of a coyote calling across the prairie. Eleanor thought about Victoria's visit, about the way the other woman had tried to make their life seem small and insufficient. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up your dreams of medical school?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "I used to. But I've realized that what I thought were my dreams were really other people's expectations. The life I have now, with you, with this ranch, this is what I actually want. Even though it's not as grand as what Victoria offered." Thomas turned to face her fully. "Eleanor, Victoria offered an illusion, beautiful on the surface but empty underneath. What we have is real. It's built on honesty and work and genuine care for each other. That's worth more than all the society parties and railroad fortunes in the world. Eleanor kissed him then, pouring all her love and relief into the contact. When they broke apart, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I should have told you. About my past before now," he said. "About Victoria, about medical school, about why I really came here. You told me when you were ready. That's what matters. I don't want there to be secrets between us." Eleanor smiled. "Then let me tell you a secret of my own. When Victoria was here today, talking about all those sophisticated things, I was terrified that you'd realize what you'd given up, that you'd see me as the consolation prize instead of the choice you actively made." Thomas cupped her face in his hands. "Eleanor Brennan, you are not a consolation prize. You're the best decision I ever made. The smartest, strongest, most beautiful woman I've ever known. And if Victoria or anyone else can't see that, it's their loss." The fervor in his voice left no room for doubt. Eleanor felt the last of her insecurity dissolve, replaced by a certainty that was as solid as the mountains surrounding their home. Victoria returned the next day, but this time Eleanor was ready for her. When the elegant woman began another round of subtle put-downs disguised as concern for Thomas's future, Eleanor met each comment with quiet confidence and unmistakable pride in the life she and Thomas had built. "You know," Victoria said after a particularly pointed exchange about the isolation of ranch life, "I'm beginning to understand why Thomas finds this arrangement appealing. There's something to be said for a simple life with simple people." Eleanor smiled sweetly. "There's nothing simple about building a successful ranch from scratch, surviving Montana winters, or saving lives during calving season. But I suppose it takes a certain kind of person to appreciate challenges that don't involve choosing between silk and satin." Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing genuine surprise at Eleanor's quick retort. Thomas, who had been watching the exchange with growing admiration, stepped closer to Eleanor and wrapped his arm around her waist. "My wife is right," he said firmly. "There's nothing simple about the life we've chosen. It requires intelligence, courage, and the ability to find beauty in honest work. Not everyone is equipped for it." Victoria left that afternoon, and Eleanor never saw her again. But her visit had served an important purpose. It had forced both Eleanor and Thomas to examine their feelings and emerge more certain than ever that they had chosen correctly. That night, as they lay in bed listening to a summer storm move across the mountains, Thomas spoke into the darkness. "I love you, Eleanor. Not because you're convenient or safe or practical. I love you because you're extraordinary." Eleanor turned in his arms, her heart full to overflowing. "I love you too, Thomas, for exactly who you are, not who anyone else thinks you should be." Outside, lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, brilliant flashes. But inside their small cabin, Eleanor and Thomas had found something that no storm could touch, a love built on truth, tested by challenge, and strong enough to weather whatever the future might bring. Autumn painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold and crimson that took Eleanor's breath away every morning. The aspen trees shimmered like coins in the crisp air, and the mountains wore crowns of early snow that caught the sunlight and threw it back in dazzling displays. It was Eleanor's first fall on the ranch, and she found herself understanding why Thomas had fallen in love with this land, despite its harsh demands. The harvest season brought its own rhythm of work. Eleanor spent her days preserving vegetables from their garden, smoking meat for the winter ahead, and helping Thomas prepare the ranch for another brutal Montana winter. But there was something different about their preparations this year, an undercurrent of excitement that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. Eleanor had suspected for weeks, but it wasn't until Dr. Mitchell confirmed it during his monthly visit to check on old Henrik Jensen's rheumatism that she allowed herself to believe it was true. She was carrying Thomas's child. The news filled her with a joy so profound it was almost frightening. But beneath the happiness lay a current of anxiety that she couldn't quite shake. Thomas had never spoken directly about wanting children, and after his revelations about Victoria and his fear of failing those he loved, Eleanor wasn't sure how he would react to becoming a father. She waited until evening to tell him, choosing a moment when they sat by the fire after a day of harvesting the last of the winter squash. Thomas was reading, his profile outlined by the dancing flames, and Eleanor found herself memorizing the scene, wanting to remember this moment before. Everything changed. "Thomas," she said softly, "I have something to tell you." He looked up from his book, immediately alert to something in her tone. "What is it? Are you feeling all right? You've been quiet today." Eleanor took a deep breath. "I'm pregnant." The words hung in the air between them. Thomas went completely still, his book forgotten in his lap. For a long moment he simply stared at her, and Eleanor began to fear she'd made a terrible mistake in hoping he would be pleased. Then his face transformed. The careful control he usually maintained crumbled, replaced by wonder, joy, and something that looked almost like terror. "Pregnant," he repeated as if testing the word. "You're certain?" "Dr. Mitchell confirmed it this afternoon. The baby should come in early spring." Thomas set his book aside and moved to kneel beside her chair, his hands reaching for hers with infinite gentleness. "Eleanor. God, Eleanor, are you happy about this?" The question surprised her. "Of course I'm happy. Aren't you?" Thomas struggled for words. "I'm terrified and I'm grateful, and so damn happy I can barely think straight." Eleanor laughed, relief flooding through her. "Terrified, I understand. The rest of it sounds perfect." Thomas pressed, his face against her hands, and Eleanor realized he was shaking. When he looked up at her again, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I never thought I'd have this," he said quietly. "A family, children. After Martha died, after everything that happened with Victoria, I convinced myself I wasn't meant for it." Eleanor cupped his face in her hands. "And now I'm scared I'll fail you both, but I want this more than I've ever wanted anything." Eleanor leaned down to kiss him, tasting salt on his lips. "You won't fail us, Thomas. I trust you completely. Even after what I told you about Martha, about how I couldn't protect her, especially after that. You learned from that pain, Thomas. It made you stronger, more careful, more aware of what really matters." Thomas rested his hand gently on her still flat stomach, his expression full of awe. Our child, Eleanor confirmed, covering his hand with hers. Word of Eleanor's pregnancy spread through the small community of Copper Falls with the speed of wildfire. Mrs. Patterson from the Church Ladies Auxiliary arrived the next week with a basket of yarn and patterns for baby clothes. Dr. Mitchell made Eleanor promise to send for him at the first sign of labor, regardless of weather conditions. Even taciturn Henrik Jensen stopped by to offer Thomas advice about childproofing the barn, but it was the changes in Thomas himself that amazed Eleanor most. The man who had been so fearful of failing those he loved threw himself into preparing for fatherhood with an intensity that was both touching and slightly overwhelming. He reinforced the cabin's foundation and added extra insulation against the cold. He built a cradle from cherry wood, sanding every surface until it was smooth as silk. He studied Dr. Mitchell's medical books with the same focus he'd once applied to Thoreau and Whitman, determined to understand everything about pregnancy and childbirth. You don't have to memorize every obstetrics text ever written, Eleanor, and told him one evening, finding him hunched over a particularly dense medical tome. I want to be prepared, Thomas said without looking up. Want to know what to expect, how to help if something goes wrong. Eleanor saw the fear lurking beneath his determination, The same fear that had paralyzed him during the blizzard when he'd been convinced he would fail her just as he'd failed Martha. But this time, instead of letting the fear consume him, Thomas was channeling it into action. "Thomas, look at me." He reluctantly raised his eyes from the book. "I'm healthy. Dr. Mitchell says everything is progressing normally. Women have been having babies for thousands of years without detailed medical knowledge. But if something happens, then we'll deal with it together. But you can't prepare for every possible problem by reading about it. Sometimes you just have to trust that things will work out." Thomas was quiet for a moment, then closed the book with a sigh. "You're right. I can't bear the thought of losing you or the baby." Eleanor moved to sit beside him on the bench. "You're not going to lose us. But even if something did happen, driving yourself to exhaustion with worry won't prevent it." Thomas pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes." "That's not a bad thing, Thomas. It means you have something precious to fight for." As winter approached, Eleanor marveled at how different this preparation felt from the previous year. Then, she'd been a stranger in a foreign land, uncertain of her place or her future. Now, she was carrying new life within her, planning for a family, preparing to bring the next generation of Brennans into the world. The first serious snowfall came in early November, and with it, an unexpected crisis. Eleanor was feeding the chickens when she heard Thomas shouting from the direction of the north pasture. She dropped the grain bucket and ran toward the sound, her heart pounding with sudden fear. She found Thomas kneeling beside Duke, their prize bull, who was clearly in severe distress. The massive animal was on his side, breathing heavily, his eyes rolled back in pain. "What happened?" Eleanor asked. "Breathless from running?" "Don't know. Found him like this. Could be bloat, could be twisted gut. Either way, he's dying." Eleanor looked at the suffering animal, then at Thomas's face. She could see the same helpless frustration that had marked his expressions during Martha's illness. The feeling of being powerless to save something precious. "What can we do?" Thomas shook his head. "Nothing. Bull this size, this far gone, even if we could get a veterinarian here in time, which we can't with the roads snowed in. There has to be something. Eleanor, I know you want to help, but some things can't be fixed. Some battles can't be won." But Eleanor was already thinking, remembering something she'd read in one of Thomas's veterinary books. "What about emergency surgery? For bloat or twisted gut? That's not something a rancher does in a field. It requires surgical instruments, sterile conditions. You have surgical instruments left over from when you were planning to go to medical school. I found them in the storage chest last month." Thomas stared at her. "Eleanor, I'm not a surgeon. I've never performed an operation on anything larger than a barn cat. But you know the theory. You've read about the procedures, and Duke is going to die anyway if we don't try." For a moment, Thomas was frozen between fear and desperate hope. Eleanor could see the battle playing out in his expression, the terror of attempting something beyond his skill level, warring with the need to act, to fight, instead of simply accepting defeat. "If I try this and it goes wrong, Duke dies in agony, instead of peacefully. And if you don't try, he dies anyway. At least this way, we're fighting for him." Thomas looked down at the suffering bull, then back at Eleanor. Slowly, decision crystallized in his eyes. "Go get the medical kit from the house, the blue case in the bedroom closet, and bring the largest pot we have, filled with boiling water. We need to sterilize everything." The next 2 hours were the most intense of Eleanor's life, working by lamplight in the makeshift surgical theater of the snow-covered pasture. She watched Thomas transform from a frightened rancher into something approaching a real doctor. His hands, which had shaken with nerves when he'd first picked up the scalpel, grew steady as muscle memory and instinct took over. His voice, initially tight with anxiety, became calm and focused as he talked himself through each step of the procedure. "Incision looks clean," he murmured, probing carefully. definitely twisted gut. If I can just... There. Eleanor watched in fascination as Thomas worked with growing confidence, his movements becoming more assured with each passing minute. This was the man he might have become, she realized. The doctor he'd dreamed of being before Victoria's betrayal had sent him fleeing to the mountains. "How can I help?" she asked. "Keep pressure on this blood vessel while I reposition the intestine. Don't let go, no matter what." Eleanor did as instructed, marveling at her husband's skill and dedication. For nearly an hour, Thomas worked over the unconscious bull, his brow furrowed in concentration, his hands moving with precision and care. "Got it," he said finally, exhaustion evident in his voice. "Guts back in position. Now I just have to close him up and pray we weren't too late." The suturing took another 30 minutes. When Thomas finally sat back on his heels, both he and Eleanor were covered in blood and exhausted beyond measure. Duke lay still, his breathing shallow but regular. "Will he live?" Eleanor asked. Thomas wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of blood across his skin. "I don't know. The next few hours will tell if he makes it through the night." They sat vigil beside the bull through the long, cold night. Eleanor brought blankets and hot coffee, and they took turns monitoring Duke's breathing and pulse. As dawn broke over the mountains, the massive animal stirred, lifted his head, and let out a confused but healthy-sounding bellow. "He's going to make it," Thomas said, wonder evident in his voice. "God Almighty, he's actually going to make it." Eleanor threw her arms around Thomas's neck, holding him tight as relief and pride overwhelmed her. "You did it. You saved him." "We did it," Thomas corrected. "I couldn't have managed without you." As they walked back to the cabin through the morning snow, Eleanor felt something profound had shifted between them. Thomas moved with a new confidence, a sense of his own capability that had been missing since his arrival in Montana. "How does it feel," she asked, "to use your medical knowledge like that?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Good. Really good. I'd forgotten how much I loved the challenge of it, the problem-solving, the feeling of actually healing something." "Do you regret giving up medicine?" "I used to. But after tonight, I think maybe I didn't give it up. Maybe I just found a different way to practice it." Eleanor understood what he meant. Out here, away from the formal structures of hospitals and medical schools, Thomas had found a way to be the healer he'd always wanted to be. Not for society matrons and railroad barons, but for the animals and people who depended on him. "The baby's lucky," Eleanor said, her hand resting on her growing belly, "to have a father who's both a rancher and a doctor." Thomas smiled, and Eleanor saw a peace in his expression that had been absent since she'd known him. He'd finally found a way to reconcile all the parts of himself, the man who loved the land, the man who wanted to heal, the man who'd learned to love without reservation. "The baby's lucky to have you for a mother," he said, pulling her close. "Someone who sees possibilities where others see only problems. Someone who pushes people to be better than they think they can be." As they reached the cabin, Eleanor reflected on how far they'd both traveled from the uncertain strangers who'd met at the train station less than a year ago. They'd built something together that was stronger than the sum of its parts, a partnership that could weather blizzards and face down sophisticated threats and even save lives when necessary. And now they were about to add another member to their small, fierce family. Eleanor couldn't wait to see what kind of person would emerge from the union of Thomas's steady strength and her own determined optimism. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was certain they would face them together, and somehow that made even the harsh Montana winter seem full of promise. The winter that year came early and stayed late, wrapping the ranch in a cocoon of snow and silence that seemed to slow time itself. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed steadily through the dark months, her body changing with the seasons as she grew rounder and more radiant with each passing week. Thomas watched over her with the devotion of a man guarding his most precious treasure, anticipating her needs before she voiced them and studying her face for any sign of discomfort. By February, Eleanor had grown large enough that simple tasks became challenges. Bending to collect eggs from the henhouse left her breathless, and climbing the ladder to the loft was out of the question. Thomas had taken over most of the heavy work without complaint, but Eleanor chafed at her enforced idleness. "I feel useless," she confessed one afternoon, as Thomas returned from feeding the cattle. Snow clung to his beard and eyebrows, and his cheeks were bright red from the cold. "You're growing our child," Thomas said, hanging his coat by the door. "That's the most important work on this ranch." Eleanor shifted uncomfortably in her chair by the fire. At 8 months pregnant, no position felt comfortable for long. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm really cut out for this. The other women in town make it look so easy." Thomas knelt beside her chair, his cold hands warming themselves against her belly. Through the fabric of her dress, they could see the baby moving, little lumps and bumps appearing and disappearing as tiny fists and feet pushed against the confines of the womb. "Look at that," Thomas murmured, wonder evident in his voice. "Strong already, just like the mother." Eleanor covered his hands with hers. "Are you ready for this? Really ready?" The question had been weighing on her mind for weeks. Thomas had thrown himself into preparing for the baby's arrival with characteristic intensity, but Eleanor sometimes caught glimpses of the old fear in his eyes, the terror of failing someone he loved. "I'm scared out of my mind," Thomas admitted, "but I've never been more ready for anything in my life." Before Eleanor could respond, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. She gasped, her hands instinctively moving to her belly. "What is it?" Thomas asked, immediately alert. "I don't know, it felt like—" Another pain, stronger this time, made her double over. "Thomas, I think something's wrong." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity and anxiety. The pains came irregularly. At first, then with increasing frequency and intensity. Thomas sent word to Dr. Mitchell in town, but the response came back that the doctor was attending a difficult birth on the other side of the county and wouldn't be available for at least 2 days. "What do we do?" Eleanor asked, through gritted teeth as another contraction gripped her. Thomas's face was pale but determined. "We do this ourselves. I've been reading everything I can get my hands on about childbirth. Mrs. Patterson said she'd help when the time came, but with this storm—" Eleanor looked out the window at the swirling snow that had been falling for hours. The wind howled around the cabin with a ferocity that spoke of nature at its most unforgiving. No one would be traveling in weather like this. "It's just us, then," she said, trying to keep the fear out of her voice. "It's just us," Thomas confirmed. "But Eleanor, we can do this. Women have been giving birth for thousands of years without doctors or hospitals, and I may not be a trained physician, but I know enough to help." As if summoned by their conversation, another contraction seized Eleanor, this one strong enough to make her cry out. Thomas helped her to the bedroom, his movements calm and efficient, despite the worry she could see in his eyes. The labor progressed slowly through the afternoon and into the evening. Thomas proved to be an unexpectedly steady companion through the ordeal, timing contractions, helping Eleanor change positions, and offering quiet encouragement when the pain became overwhelming. "I can't do this," Eleanor gasped during a particularly intense contraction. "It hurts too much." "Yes, you can," Thomas said firmly, wiping her face with a cool cloth. "You're the strongest person I know, and our baby needs you to be strong right now." Eleanor gripped his hand so tightly she was sure she must be cutting off his circulation, but Thomas never complained or tried to pull away. He stayed beside her through the long night, his presence a constant source of comfort and strength. As dawn approached, Eleanor felt something change. The contractions intensified to a level that made her previous pain seem insignificant. And she felt an overwhelming urge to push. "Thomas," she panted, I think it's time." Thomas positioned himself at the foot of the bed, his medical knowledge finally put to the ultimate test. "I can see the head," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "Eleanor, our baby's almost here." The next few minutes were a haze of effort and pain and desperate determination. Eleanor pushed with every ounce of strength she possessed, drawing on reserves of power she hadn't known she had. Thomas guided her through each contraction, his voice steady and encouraging, even as tears streamed down his face. Then, with a final push that seemed to take everything Eleanor had left, their baby slipped into the world. "It's a girl," Thomas said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Eleanor, we have a daughter." Through her exhaustion, Eleanor heard the most beautiful sound in the world, her baby's first cry, strong and indignant and utterly perfect. Thomas quickly cleared the infant's airways and wrapped her in the soft blankets they'd prepared, then placed her gently on Eleanor's chest. Eleanor looked down at her daughter's tiny, wrinkled face and felt her heart expand with a love so fierce it took her breath away. The baby had Thomas's dark hair and what looked like Eleanor's nose, and her small fists waved frantically as she continued to voice her displeasure at being ejected from her warm, dark world. "She's beautiful," Eleanor whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Thomas, look what we made." Thomas sat on the edge of the bed, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders as they both stared at their daughter in wonder. "She's perfect, absolutely perfect." The baby gradually quieted, seeming to recognize her parents' voices. Her eyes, dark blue like all newborns, opened briefly before closing again as she settled into sleep. "What should we name her?" Eleanor asked. Thomas was quiet for a moment, studying their daughter's peaceful face. "What about Rose, for the wild roses that bloom on the prairie in summer?" Eleanor smiled. "Rose Brennan. It's perfect." The next few weeks passed in a haze of sleepless nights and overwhelming love. Rose proved to be a healthy, vigorous baby who demanded attention at all hours. Eleanor marveled at how quickly she and Thomas adapted to their new roles as parents, working together to care for their daughter with the same partnership that had made their marriage successful. Thomas surprised Eleanor with his natural aptitude for fatherhood. The man who had been so afraid of failing those he loved proved to be endlessly patient with midnight feedings, diaper changes, and the countless small crises that arose with a newborn. He sang to Rose in his deep, rumbling voice, walked the floor with her when she was fussy, and watched over her sleep with the intensity of a guard protecting a treasure. "You're going to spoil her," Eleanor warned one morning, finding Thomas standing over the cradle he'd built, simply watching Rose sleep. "Good," Thomas replied without taking his eyes off his daughter. "She deserves to be spoiled. She's the most precious thing in the world." Eleanor joined him at the cradle, slipping her arm around his waist. Rose slept peacefully, one tiny fist curled near her cheek. In sleep, she looked like a perfect angel, all the struggles of birth and adjustment forgotten. "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked quietly. Thomas turned to look at her, and Eleanor saw an expression of such complete contentment that it took her breath away. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it. A year ago, I thought I'd lost everything that mattered. Now I have. A wife I adore, a daughter who's perfect in every way, and a life that's fuller than I ever dreamed possible. Even though it's not the life you originally planned, especially because it's not the life I originally planned. The life I thought I wanted was based on other people's expectations, other people's definitions of success. This life, our life, is, built on what actually matters." Eleanor thought about their journey from strangers to partners to parents. It hadn't been easy, but every challenge had made them stronger, more certain of what they meant to each other. "I love our life," she said. Simply, "So do I." Spring arrived late that year, but when it finally came, it brought a burst of activity that energized the entire ranch. The cattle that had survived the harsh winter were healthy and strong, ready for another season of breeding and growth. The vegetable garden Eleanor had planned during the dark winter months began to take shape as Thomas prepared the soil for planting. But the biggest change was in the rhythm of their daily lives. Every activity now revolved around Rose's needs and schedule. Eleanor carried her daughter in a sling while she worked in the garden, and Thomas had constructed a portable cradle that he could take to the barn during chores. "She's going to grow up thinking cows and horses are just larger versions of pets," Eleanor observed one afternoon as she watched Thomas introduce Rose to the new calves. "Could be worse," Thomas replied, holding their 3-month-old daughter securely as she stared wide-eyed at a curious heifer. She could grow up thinking the only animals worth knowing come from picture books. Eleanor marveled at how naturally Rose fit into their ranch life. She seemed fascinated by the sounds and smells of the barnyard, and she rarely fussed during the outdoor work that occupied so much of their time. It was as if she'd been born understanding that this was her world. These animals and wide spaces, and endless sky. The first real test of their new family dynamic came in late spring, when Dr. Mitchell finally made his delayed visit to check on Rose's health. Eleanor had been confident that her daughter was thriving, but she found herself surprisingly nervous as the elderly doctor examined the baby. "She's perfect," Dr. Mitchell pronounced after a thorough examination. "Good weight, excellent reflexes, lungs that could wake the dead when she wants to. You've done excellent work here, both of you." Eleanor felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with her own accomplishments and everything to do with seeing Thomas's face light up with paternal satisfaction. "Any concerns I should know about?" Thomas asked. "None at all, though I will. You say, Thomas, your wife tells me you delivered this baby yourself during that February blizzard. That's no small feat for someone without formal medical training." Thomas glanced at Eleanor, then back at the doctor. "I did what needed to be done. Had some medical knowledge from my younger days." "Well, whatever knowledge you had, you used it well. Mother and baby both came through beautifully. You should be proud." After Dr. Mitchell left, Eleanor found Thomas sitting on the porch, Rose sleeping peacefully in his arms. The evening light caught the gold in her dark hair and made her tiny face look even more angelic than usual. "Proud father?" Eleanor asked, settling beside them. "Proud of everything," Thomas said. "Proud of Rose, proud of you, proud of what we've built together. Even proud of yourself?" Thomas considered the question seriously. "Yes, for the first time in years, I'm actually proud of myself. Not for what I might have been or what others expected me to become, but for who I actually am." Eleanor leaned against his shoulder, watching their daughter sleep. Around them, the ranch hummed with the quiet activity of evening, cattle lowing. In the distance, horses moving peacefully in the pasture, the soft sounds of a world settling into rest. "What do you think she'll become?" Eleanor asked, nodding toward Rose. "Whatever she wants to become," Thomas said firmly. "Rancher, doctor, teacher, explorer, doesn't matter to me as long as she's happy and knows she's loved." Eleanor smiled. "I think she'll be strong, like her parents." "Strong and stubborn and completely irresistible," Thomas agreed. "Poor thing don't stand a chance." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Eleanor reflected on the strange turns her life had taken. 1.5 years ago, she'd been a lonely spinster in Chicago, facing a future that seemed empty of possibility. Now she was a wife, a mother, and a full partner in a life that challenged and fulfilled her in ways she'd never imagined. The silent rancher who had met her at the train station had become the love of her life, and together they'd created something beautiful. Not just their daughter, but an entire way of being in the world that was uniquely their own. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" for answering my advertisement, for giving me a chance, for building this life with me. Thomas shifted Rose to one arm so he could pull Eleanor closer. Thank you for being brave enough to come out here, for seeing possibilities where I only saw problems, for making me believe in second chances, as if sensing the importance of the moment. Rose stirred in her father's arms, opening her eyes briefly to look up at her parents. For a moment, all three of them were connected in perfect understanding. A family bound not by chance or convenience, but by choice and love and the determination to build something lasting together. Then Rose yawned hugely and settled back into sleep, and Eleanor and Thomas shared a quiet laugh at their daughter's perfectly timed commentary on adult sentimentality. But the moment had been real, and its meaning would stay with them always. They had found their place in the world, all three of them, and no force on earth could shake the foundation they'd built together. 5 years had transformed the Brennan Ranch into something that would have been unrecognizable to the lonely man who had once worked its boundaries in solitude. The original cabin, while still the heart of their home, now boasted additional rooms that Thomas had built as their family grew. A proper medical office occupied one corner of the expanded structure, complete with surgical instruments and a growing library of medical texts that Thomas consulted when neighboring ranchers brought him their most challenging cases. Eleanor stood in the doorway of that office now, watching her husband examine a young Mustang that had tangled with barbed wire. At 6 years old, Rose sat beside her father with the serious concentration of a medical apprentice, handing him instruments and offering commentary that was both precocious and surprisingly insightful. "The cut's not deep enough to damage muscle," Rose observed, peering at the horse's leg with Thomas's own intense focus. "But it needs cleaning to prevent infection." Thomas smiled at his daughter's assessment. "That's exactly right. What should we use to clean it? Carbolic acid solution, but we have to be gentle because horses are more sensitive than cattle." Eleanor marveled at how naturally Rose had absorbed the medical knowledge that filled their household conversations. The little girl could discuss anatomy and treatment protocols with the same ease other children reserved for fairy tales and nursery rhymes. Yet she was also completely at home on horseback, helping with ranch work and charming every visitor with her quick wit and fearless spirit. "Mama, can I help Papa stitch the cut?" Rose asked, turning to Eleanor with eyes that were identical to Thomas's, except for their complete lack of fear or hesitation. "If your father thinks you're ready for it," Eleanor replied, though she suspected Thomas would soon run out of excuses to delay teaching Rose actual surgical techniques. The child had been begging to learn suturing for months. The Mustang's treatment concluded successfully, with Rose providing commentary that impressed even its owner, old Jake Morrison from the neighboring ranch. As Morrison led his horse away, he shook his head in wonder. "That daughter of yours is going to be quite something when she grows up, Thomas. Got the mind of a doctor and the heart of a cowboy. Rare combination." After Morrison left, Eleanor helped Thomas clean and organize his medical instruments while Rose ran outside to check on her pet rabbit. The domestic routine felt as natural as breathing now, though Eleanor sometimes caught herself marveling at how completely their lives had diverged from anything she might have imagined during those first uncertain months of marriage. "Mrs. Chen asked if we'd consider sending Rose to the new school they're building in town," Eleanor mentioned as she sterilized a set of forceps. "She thinks Rose would benefit from formal education with other children." Thomas paused in his organization of medical supplies. The question of Rose's education had been weighing on both their minds, as their daughter's intellectual curiosity continued to outpace what they could provide at home. "What do you think?" he asked. Eleanor considered carefully. "I think Rose needs challenges we can't give her here. But I also worry about sending her away from everything she knows." "She wouldn't have to board in town," Thomas said. I could take her in the mornings and pick her up in the evenings, at least during good weather. The practical solution was sensible, but Eleanor sensed deeper currents in Thomas's reluctance to consider formal schooling for Rose. He'd built his life around self-sufficiency and independence from the judgment of others. The idea of submitting their daughter to institutional evaluation and social comparison went against every instinct he'd developed since leaving Denver. "Thomas," Eleanor said gently, "what are you really worried about?" He set down the instrument. He'd been cleaning and looked directly at her. What if they tried to change her, make her fit some mold of what a proper young lady should be? Eleanor understood immediately. Rose was everything Thomas valued. Intelligent, fearless, competent, and completely authentic. The thought of subjecting her to social pressures that might diminish those qualities was genuinely frightening to a man who had seen his own dreams nearly destroyed by others' expectations. "They won't change her," Eleanor said firmly. "Rose is too strong for that, and besides, we'll still be her primary influence. School will just give her additional tools to work with." Before Thomas could respond, Rose burst through the door with the dramatic flair that characterized most of her entrances. "Papa! Mama! There's a wagon coming up the road, and it's got the fanciest horses I've ever seen." Eleanor and Thomas exchanged glances. Visitors were still relatively rare at the ranch, and fancy horses usually meant someone from town or beyond, possibly someone official or important. They walked outside to see an elegant carriage approaching, pulled by a matched pair of bay horses that were indeed impressive by local standards. As it drew closer, Eleanor recognized the driver as Henderson from the general store, but the passenger was a stranger, a well-dressed woman whose expensive traveling clothes and careful posture suggested city origins. The carriage stopped near the house, and Henderson helped his passenger down with obvious deference. She was a handsome woman in her 40s, with graying hair arranged in the latest fashion and intelligent eyes that swept over the ranch with keen interest. "Mr. and Mrs. Brennan?" she asked, approaching with confident steps. "I'm Margaret Whitman from the Territorial Education Department. I've heard quite remarkable things about your family." Eleanor felt Thomas tense beside her, and she understood his wariness. Official visits rarely brought good news to people who valued their privacy and independence. "What can we do for you, Mrs. Whitman?" Eleanor asked politely. "Actually, it's what I might be able to do for you, specifically for your daughter." Mrs. Whitman's gaze found Rose, who was studying the visitor with characteristic directness. "I understand she's shown exceptional aptitude for both academic subjects and practical sciences." "Who told you that?" Thomas asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Dr. Mitchell, actually. He's been quite vocal about Rose's precocious understanding of medical principles, and Mrs. Chen mentioned her mathematical abilities. Word of unusual talents travels quickly in a territory like ours." Eleanor felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. She was pleased that others recognized Rose's exceptional abilities, but she shared Thomas's instinctive distrust of outside attention. "What exactly are you proposing?" Eleanor asked. Mrs. Whitman smiled, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of genuine enthusiasm beneath her professional demeanor. "I'm here to offer Rose a scholarship to the Territorial Academy in Helena. Full funding, including room and board, for a complete education that would prepare her for university studies in any field she chooses." The silence that followed was profound. Eleanor felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Helena was 300 miles away, a different world from their isolated ranch. "She's only 6 years old," Thomas said finally, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "The scholarship wouldn't begin until she's 8, Mrs. Whitman clarified, "but I wanted to discuss it with you now, so you'd have time to consider. Opportunities like this are rare, especially for children in remote areas." Rose, who had been listening to the adult conversation with growing excitement, stepped forward. What's a territorial academy? Mrs. Whitman knelt to Rose's level, her expression warm and encouraging. It's a school where very bright children go to learn advanced subjects. Mathematics, science, literature, history, everything you'd need to become whatever you want to be when you grow up. Could I still be a doctor? Rose asked. You could be anything you want. Doctor, scientist, teacher, explorer. The academy would prepare you for all of those possibilities. Eleanor watched her daughter's face light up with the kind of excitement she usually reserved for helping with difficult medical cases or learning to handle a particularly challenging horse. The child's intellectual hunger was evident, and Eleanor realized with a pang that their isolated ranch, wonderful as it was, might not be enough to satisfy Rose's growing curiosity about the world. "We'll need time to discuss this," Thomas said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. Mrs. Whitman rose gracefully. "Of course, take all the time you need, but please remember, talents like Rose's are rare and precious. They deserve every opportunity to flourish." After the visitor left, the family retreated to the house in thoughtful silence. Rose went immediately to her books, her mind clearly racing with possibilities, while Eleanor and Thomas sat by the fire without speaking. "She wants to go," Eleanor said finally. "You can see it in her face." Thomas stared into the flames. "She's 6 years old. She doesn't understand what she'd be giving up." "What would she be giving up?" "This, us, the life we've built here. She'd become someone different, someone who doesn't belong here anymore." Eleanor heard the pain in her husband's voice and understood its source. Thomas was terrified of losing the daughter who had become the center of his world, terrified that education and exposure to broader opportunities would take Rose away from them permanently. "Thomas, look at me." He turned reluctantly to meet her gaze. "Rose isn't going to stop being our daughter just because she gets a formal education. She'll always be the girl who learned to suture wounds by watching you, who can handle horses like she was born in the saddle, who thinks the most exciting place in the world is our barn during calving season. But she'll also see other possibilities, other ways of living. Yes, she will, and that's exactly what we should want for her." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. What if she decides she doesn't want to come back? What if the ranch isn't enough for her anymore? Eleanor moved closer, taking his hands in hers. "Then we'll support whatever choice she makes, because we love her enough to want her happiness more than our own comfort." The debate continued for weeks, with Rose herself becoming an increasingly vocal advocate for the academy opportunity. She peppered them with questions about Helena, about the courses she might take, about the other students she might meet. Her excitement was infectious, but it also made the prospect of separation more painful for Thomas. The turning point came during a medical emergency that required Thomas's skills. A mining accident in the hills had injured several men, and Thomas was called to provide emergency treatment. Rose accompanied him, as she often did when he made house calls, and Eleanor watched her daughter work alongside her father with the calm competence of someone twice her age. "She's remarkable," commented the mine foreman, as Rose assisted Thomas in setting a broken arm. "Never seen a child so comfortable around injury and blood." Later, as they rode home through the mountain twilight, Rose chatted excitedly about the procedures she'd witnessed and the questions she wanted to research in Thomas's medical books. "Papa," she said suddenly, "if I went to that school Mrs. Whitman talked about, I could learn more about medicine, couldn't I? Things that might help me be a better assistant to you." Thomas pulled their wagon to a stop and looked down at his daughter's eager face. In that moment, Eleanor saw him finally understand what she'd been trying to tell him, that Rose's education wouldn't take her away from them. It would make her a better version of herself, better equipped to contribute to the life they'd built. "Together, yes," he said quietly, "you could learn things that would make you an even better doctor than your old father." Rose beamed. Then I want to go, not forever, just to learn things and come back smarter. That night, Eleanor found Thomas sitting on the porch long after Rose had gone to bed. The summer night was warm and clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "You've decided," she said, settling beside him. "I've decided. We'll send her to the academy." Eleanor felt relief and sadness in equal measure. "It's the right choice." "I know it is. That doesn't make it easier." They sat in comfortable silence, both thinking about the future that lay ahead. Rose would leave them for months at a time, returning for summers and holidays. She would meet new people, encounter new ideas, and gradually grow into someone they couldn't entirely predict or control. "She'll come back to us," Eleanor said with quiet certainty. "This place, this life, it's part of who she is. Education will add to that, not replace it." Thomas nodded slowly. "And when she does come back, she'll be able to help people in ways I never could, maybe even become the doctor I once dreamed of being." 2 years later, Eleanor stood on the same porch, watching Thomas help an 8-year-old Rose into the wagon that would take her to town, where she would catch the stage to Helena and her first term at the Territorial Academy. Rose was excited, but trying to be brave about leaving, chattering nervously about her packed trunk and the books she'd been told to bring. "Remember to write to us every week," Eleanor called. "I will, Mama, and I'll tell you everything I learn, so you won't miss anything important." Thomas lifted Rose onto the wagon seat beside him, and Eleanor saw him pause for a moment, his hands lingering on his daughter's shoulders, as if trying to memorize the feeling of her small presence. "Be good," he told her. "Learn everything you can, and remember that home will always be waiting for you. I love you, Papa. You too, Mama." As the wagon rolled away, Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pride, of love, and of absolute confidence in the choice they'd made. Thomas returned from town that evening quieter than usual, but there was peace in his expression, along with the natural sadness of separation. "How do you feel?" Eleanor asked as they sat by the fire in a house that seemed too quiet without Rose's chatter. "Proud," Thomas said simply. "Scared, but proud. We're giving her something neither of us ever had, real choices about her future." Eleanor moved to sit beside him on the couch they'd bought when Rose was learning to walk. The house was full of memories of their daughters growing up, but it was also full of the life she and Thomas had built together. "What about us?" she asked. "What do we do now?" Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his face in the way that still made Eleanor's heart skip. "Now, we take care of each other, keep building this life we've made, and wait for our doctor daughter to come home and tell us all about the big world she's going to help heal." Eleanor curled against Thomas's side, feeling the solid warmth of the man who had become everything she'd never dared to hope for. Outside, the Montana wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying the promise of seasons to come. Their story was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The silent rancher who had met a desperate woman at a train station during a blizzard had become the foundation of a family that would span generations. And Eleanor Hayes, who had risked everything for a chance at belonging somewhere, had found not just a home, but a love that would endure whatever challenges the future might bring. In the dancing firelight of their quiet cabin, they sat together, planning tomorrow's work, discussing improvements to the ranch, and counting the days until Rose's first letter would arrive. They had built something lasting and beautiful in the wilderness, not just a ranch or a house, but a legacy of love that would weather any storm. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.